The neon sign of the late-night cafe hummed with a low, electric buzz that filled the gaps between the rain hitting the pavement outside. It was 3:00 a.m., the hour of the desperate and the invisible. Inside, the air smelled of burnt espresso and floor wax. Yoon Ara was busy reorganizing the pastry case, her movements frantic and loud, providing the only heartbeat to the desolate room. In the back booth, shrouded in the blue shadows of the Seoul night, sat a man in a simple black coat. He was as still as a statue, his presence heavy enough to anchor the entire room. The piece didn't break, it shattered. The door kicked open, bringing a gust of wet wind and Jang Hoon. He was vibrating with a reckless amateur energy, a cheap mask pulled over his face and a handgun gripped too tight in his white-knuckled hand. "Register, now!" he screamed, the barrel of the gun waving a jagged arc through the air. Ara shrieked, collapsing behind the pastry case. The few other patrons scrambled, the sound of chairs scraping against tiles sounding like gunfire itself. Han Seojin didn't stop her task. She was mid-wipe on the linoleum counter, the rag moving in a steady, rhythmic circle. As the robber shoved the gun toward her face, close enough for the metal to catch the overhead light, Seojin didn't blink. She didn't look at the muzzle, she looked at the sweat dripping from the robber's chin. Her hands remained flat on the counter, steady as stone. To her, this wasn't a tragedy, it was an interruption. "I'll take the order when you're finished with that," she said. Her voice was low, melodic, and terrifyingly level. "But you're dripping water on my clean floor." In the back booth, Kang Minyi's hand froze an inch above his coffee cup. He didn't reach for the weapon hidden beneath his coat. He didn't even look at the gunman. His entire world narrowed down to that voice, a sound he hadn't heard in a decade, yet one that had echoed in his dreams every night since the bridge. The Iron King of the underworld felt something he hadn't felt in years, a fracture in his composure. Behind his cold eyes, a locked door was being forced open. He knew that tone. He knew that lack of fear. The robber's hand began to shake, intimidated by the waitress's silence, but Minyi was the one who felt truly powerless. The gunman's breathing was a jagged, ugly sound in the sudden silence of the cafe. Jang Hoon didn't know what to do with a woman who looked at a hollow-point bullet like a late delivery order. He stepped closer, the muzzle of the gun trembling inches from Seojin's forehead, but she simply placed the damp rag on the counter and folded her arms. In the back booth, Kang Minyi sat in a pocket of absolute stillness. The world around him had turned into a blurred smear of neon blue and gray, leaving only Seojin in sharp, agonizing focus. His heart, usually a cold and disciplined machine, hammered against his ribs with a violence no enemy had ever provoked. It was her. He didn't need to see the scar he knew was hidden beneath her sleeve or the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear. It was the voice, that steady, haunting resonance that had once pulled him back from the ledge of a rain-slicked bridge when he was nothing but a broken boy with a bloodied soul. For 10 years, he had searched for that ghost. He had built an empire of iron and shadow, partly to find her and partly to become a man worthy of the life she had forced him to keep. And here she was, wiping counters in a dying cafe at 3 a.m. "Do you hear me?" Jang Hoon hissed, his voice cracking with a frantic, lethal desperation. "Give me the money or I'll open your head." Minyi's hand finally moved. It wasn't the instinctive reach for the 9 tucked into his waistband, nor was it the signal for his men waiting in the black sedan outside. His fingers simply gripped the edge of the laminate table until the wood groaned. He was paralyzed by a terrifying realization. If he stepped forward, the mask he had spent a decade perfecting would shatter. If he saved her, he would lose the anonymity that kept her safe from his world. Seojin leaned in, her eyes flat and devoid of the adrenaline that should have been fueling her. "The silent alarm was pressed 30 seconds ago," she lied, her voice an icy caress that made the robber flinch. "You can leave now and be a failure, or stay another minute and be a prisoner. Which one fits your schedule?" Minyi watched, breathless. She wasn't just unafraid, she was hollow. The girl who had saved him on the bridge had been filled with a desperate, burning empathy. This woman was a fortress of glass, clear, hard, and empty. The realization cut deeper than any blade. He had spent 10 years chasing a savior, only to find a woman who looked like she was waiting for the world to finally pull the trigger. The digital world didn't care about the heavy silence that followed the robber's retreat. It only cared about the spectacle. By sunrise, the grainy footage from the cafe's security camera had been ripped, uploaded, and captioned 1,000 different ways. "The no panic waitress," the headlines read. "The woman with ice in her veins." Seojin sat in the employee break room, staring at the small screen of her phone. In the video, her own face looked like a mask. She watched herself dismiss a man with a gun as if he were a minor inconvenience, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pride. It was the cold, creeping realization that the nothingness she had built was being dismantled by a million anonymous clicks. Across town, in a precinct filled with the smell of stale coffee and printer toner, Detective Kim Hyun-soo watched the same clip for the 15th time. He didn't care about the viral sensation or the memes. He was focused on the way Seojin's hands never moved from the counter, the way she didn't look at the gun, but at the man. "She's not brave," Hyun-soo whispered, leaning back in his creaky chair as he scribbled a note in his ledger. "She's trained, or she's seen so much blood that a handgun looks like a toy." He pulled a dusty file from the corner of his desk labeled Suyeon. The patterns were starting to emerge, thin as spider silk, but just as connected. He grabbed his coat. It was time to visit the late-night cafe for more than just a caffeine fix. But the police weren't the only ones watching. In a high-rise office overlooking the Han River, Lee Tae-ho stared at a frozen frame of the video. He didn't look at the waitress's face. He looked at the reflection in the window behind her. He recognized the silhouette of the man in the back booth, the stillness of Kang Min-yi. Tae-ho smiled, a dry, papery sound escaping his lips. He had been looking for a way to rattle the Iron King, and fate had just handed him a ghost from the past wrapped in a viral trend. The shadows of the underworld, long dormant and lurking in the corners of Seoul, began to shift their weight. They weren't just converging on a cafe. They were hunting a woman who had forgotten that being noticed was the most dangerous thing a ghost could do. The cafe was a skeleton of its daytime self, the closed sign dangling crookedly against the glass. Inside, the only light came from the humming refrigerator and the rhythmic flicker of a street lamp outside. Seojin was mopping the floor, her movements mechanical and precise, when the bell above the door gave a solitary, mournful chime. She didn't look up. She knew the weight of that footstep. It wasn't the frantic scuffle of a robber or the tired trudge of a regular. It was the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who owned the ground he walked on. "We're closed," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness like a low-frequency hum. "I'm not here for coffee, Seojin." The sound of her name, spoken in that deep, gravelly baritone, caused the mop to stutter for a fraction of a second. It was the first crack in her armor. She finally looked up. Kang Min-yi stood by the counter, his simple black coat damp from the mist. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like a man haunting his own life. He didn't move toward her. He stayed in the shadows, his eyes searching hers for a spark of the girl he remembered. 10 years, he murmured. "I spent 10 years wondering if I'd imagined you, if the girl on the Mapo Bridge was just a fever dream born of my own blood loss." Seojin leaned against the mop handle, her expression as flat as the stagnant water in her bucket. "You have the wrong woman. I've worked here for 3 years. Before that, I was nobody, nowhere." Min-yi stepped into the light, his face hardening. "Then do one thing for me. Repeat the words. The ones you whispered when the rain was so loud I could barely hear my own heart stopping. Tell me to just breathe one more time, and if your voice doesn't tremble, I'll walk out that door and never return." The silence that followed was suffocating. Seojin felt the ghost of her sister, Suyeon, standing in the corner of the room. She felt the cold wind of the bridge and the copper taste of fear she had spent a decade suppressing. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze a void of calculated indifference. "I don't know what bridge you're talking about," she said, her voice a perfect, level lie. "And I don't know you. You're just another customer who stayed too long." Min-yi didn't flinch, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He recognized the lie for what it was, a sanctuary. He leaned in close, the scent of rain and expensive tobacco clinging to him. "You've gotten good at playing dead, Seojin, but the world saw you yesterday, and they won't let you stay buried." He turned and walked out, leaving the bell ringing in his wake. Seo-jin gripped the mop until her knuckles turned white, the silence of the cafe suddenly louder than any scream. The smell of gasoline was the first thing to pierce Seo-jin's sleep. It was a sharp, chemical intrusion into the cramped studio apartment above the cafe. By the time she swung her legs off the bed, the orange glow was already licking at the floorboards. There was no shout of warning, no dramatic explosion, just the hungry, rhythmic roar of fire devouring the only sanctuary she had left. She didn't scream. She moved with the cold, practiced efficiency of a woman who had already lost everything once before. She grabbed her sister's faded photograph and a heavy coat, stepping onto the fire escape just as the windows below shattered from the heat. Down in the alley, a black sedan sat idling, its headlights cutting through the smoke like the eyes of a predator. Lee Tae-ho's message was loud and clear. If she wouldn't come out of the shadows, he would burn them away. A hand, firm and gloved, caught her elbow as she reached the bottom rung. It wasn't the rough grip of a thug. It was the steadying hold of someone who had been waiting for the collapse. Kang Min-yi stood there, his face illuminated by the flickering wreckage of her life. Behind him, the cafe was a pyre, the neon sign melting into a puddle of blue glass. "They won't stop at the building," Min-yi said, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. "Tae-ho doesn't want the cafe. He wants the woman who didn't flinch." Seo-jin looked at the fire, then at the man. The calculation in her eyes was sharp. She knew that stepping into his car meant stepping into the very world that had swallowed her sister whole. But the heat at her back was a reminder that she no longer had the luxury of nothingness. "Where?" she asked, her voice raspy from the smoke but still devoid of fear. "Somewhere he can't reach, my estate." He opened the door of the sedan, the interior smelling of leather and cold air. "I need a private server, someone who knows how to keep their mouth shut and their hands steady. It's a job, Seo-jin, nothing more." It was a transparent lie, a thin veil of professional necessity draped over a desperate act of protection. They both knew it. As the car sped away, leaving the charred remains of the cafe behind, Seo-jin watched the flames recede in the rearview mirror. She was no longer a ghost in a late-night diner. She was a guest in a fortress, a protected asset in a war she had tried to forget. As they passed through the heavy iron gates of Min-yi's estate, she realized the fire hadn't just destroyed her home. It had forged the first link in a chain that would drag her back to the truth. The estate was a labyrinth of polished marble and stifling silence, a place where secrets were buried beneath the weight of luxury. In the sub-level library, away from the soft clink of tea service and the watchful eyes of the house staff, Choi Yoon-woo sat before a wall of monitors. The light from the screens cast a ghostly pallor over his sharp, intellectual features. As the syndicate strategist, his job was to see the patterns others missed, and the girl upstairs was a jagged line in an otherwise perfect blueprint. He clicked through a series of redacted police files and old news clippings from the underworld's bloody transition a decade ago. The face in the viral cafe video was older, leaner, and harder, but the bone structure was unmistakable. He pulled up a grainy photo of a woman named Han Soo-yeon, a legendary figure whose disappearance had nearly leveled the organization. The resemblance wasn't just physical, it was in the eyes, that same terrifying glacial calm. The door slid open, and Min-yi entered. He didn't look like a man who had just saved a life. He looked like a man who was drowning in it. "She's settled in the East Wing," Min-yi said, his voice tight. "You should have left her in the fire," Yoon-woo replied, not turning from the screen. He tapped a key, magnifying Seo-jin's identification file. "I've finished the deep dive. Her name isn't just a coincidence, Min-yi. She is Han Soo-yeon's younger sister. The one who survived the bridge." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the glass of the monitors. Min-yi's gaze fixed on the photo of the two sisters, a rare moment of captured warmth from a lifetime ago. "I know who she is," Min-yi said softly. "Then you know you've invited a live grenade into your home," Yoon-woo countered, finally turning his chair. His voice was a clinical contrast to Min-yi's suppressed emotion. "She isn't just a waitress with a past. She is a direct link to Lee Tae-ho's original sin. Every second she breathes under this roof, you are signaling to the entire underworld that you are compromised. Tae-ho didn't burn that cafe to kill her. He burned it to see if you would move for her. You did exactly what he wanted. Yunwoo stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. She is a liability that will explode, Minyi. Whether she does it out of vengeance for her sister or simply because she has nothing left to lose, she will take this house down with her. You think you're protecting her, but you're just holding the pin. Minyi looked at the screen, at the girl who had told him to breathe when his world was ending. Then I'll be the one to catch the blast, he whispered. The garden of the estate was a masterpiece of controlled nature, filled with stone lanterns and the scent of damp earth. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that didn't soothe but rather demanded a confession. Seo-jin stood by a low stone wall, watching the mist roll off the manicured hedges. She was dressed in the clothes they had provided, expensive, soft, and entirely wrong. They felt like a shroud. A shadow lengthened across the gravel path. Minyi didn't announce himself. He simply existed in the space beside her, his presence a constant, heavy heat against the midnight chill. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the distant trickle of a water feature, rhythmic and persistent as a ticking clock. "You haven't touched your dinner," Minyi said eventually. His voice was stripped of its authority, sounding almost weary. "My staff says you haven't left this spot for hours. What are you looking for out there?" "The exit," Seo-jin replied, though she didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the perimeter fence. "But the walls here are much higher than the ones I built for myself." Minyi stepped closer, his hand hovering near hers on the stone wall before he pulled it back, as if afraid the contact might shatter the fragile truce between them. "Yunwoo thinks you're a threat. He thinks you're here to burn this place down from the inside out. He sees your lack of fear as a weapon." Seo-jin finally turned to him. In the moonlight, the calculated indifference she wore like a second skin began to fray at the edges. Her eyes weren't cold, they were exhausted. A small, bitter laugh escaped her lips, a sound so sharp it seemed to cut the air. "He's wrong," she whispered. "Everyone is wrong. You think I'm brave because I didn't flinch at the gun. You think I'm strong because I stayed quiet. But it isn't bravery, Minyi." She stepped toward him, the mask finally falling away to reveal a hollow, aching void. Her voice trembled, the low melody of it finally breaking. "I didn't stay still because I was calculating. I stayed still because I was hoping he'd do it. I've been standing on that bridge for 10 years, waiting for the world to finish what it started the night Soo-yeon disappeared. I'm not a hero. I'm just a woman who has been waiting to stop breathing." The confession hung between them, more volatile than any threat Yunwoo could have imagined. Minyi reached out, his fingers finally grazing her jaw, forcing her to look at him. For the first time, he didn't see a ghost or a savior. He saw a girl who had survived the fire only to be frozen by the ash. The invitation arrived not as a letter, but as a ghost. A small, silver butterfly brooch, the exact one Soo-yeon had been wearing the night the world fell apart, was left on Seo-jin's bedside table inside the most secure room of the estate. It was a silent scream, a reminder that no walls were high enough to keep out the man who had authored her grief. The meeting took place in the back of a moving car, the city lights of Seoul blurring into long, jagged streaks of gold against the tinted windows. Lee Tae-ho sat beside her, looking every bit the elder statesman of the underworld. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and ancient sins. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply placed a tablet on the leather seat between them. On the screen was a live feed of a woman in a sterile, white room. She was older, her hair streaked with premature gray, but the way she tilted her head as she read a book was a knife to Seo-jin's heart. "She was always the more valuable of the two," Tae-ho said, his voice a dry, papery rasp. "You were the heart, Seo-jin, but Soo-yeon, she was the mind. I didn't kill her. You don't destroy a masterpiece just because it's difficult to handle. I used her. Her insights, her connections, she is the foundation this empire was built upon." Seo-jin's hand moved toward the screen, her fingers trembling against the glass. The nothingness she had cultivated for a decade evaporated, replaced by a raw, suffocating hope that felt more like a curse. "Where is she?" Tae-ho smiled, a thin, bloodless curve of the lips. "She is in a gilded cage of her own making, and she can stay there or she can be returned to you. The choice, as it always has been, is yours." He leaned back, the shadows of the car swallowing his features. Minyi is a sentimental fool. He thinks he's protecting you, but he's actually the only thing standing in the way of a peaceful transition of power. He has the ledger I need, the one that lists the offshore accounts of the old guard. He leaned in closer, the scent of his cologne turning cloying. Give me the access codes to Minyi's private safe. Betray the man who thinks he's your savior, and I will bring Su-yeon to you before the sun rises. One sister for one man's downfall. A fair trade, wouldn't you say? Seo-jin looked at the flickering image of the sister she had mourned for 10 years. The calculation was no longer about survival. It was about the price of a soul. She felt the weight of Minyi's touch from the garden still lingering on her jaw, a warmth that now felt like a brand. I'll do it, she whispered, the words sounding like a death sentence. The air inside Minyi's study was heavy with the scent of old paper and the quiet hum of a digital empire. Seo-jin stood before his private safe, her reflection caught in the polished steel. She didn't look like a woman committing a betrayal. She looked like a surgeon about to make a necessary, agonizing cut. Earlier that evening, she had met Detective Kim Hyun-soo in a crowded subway station. He had looked at her with a mixture of pity and professional curiosity as he strapped the thin, adhesive wire to the small of her back. If they find this, you're dead before I can reach the door, he had warned. She had simply adjusted her sweater, her pulse as steady as a mountain stream. Then she had gone to Minyi. She hadn't given him the codes Tiho wanted, but she had given him the truth, filtered through the lens of a gamble. She allowed him to slip a micro-tracker into the lining of her coat, a silent tether to the only man who still believed she was worth saving. Now, as she walked toward the industrial docks where Tiho's men waited, the unflinching mask was her only shield. The crane shadows stretched over the shipping containers like long, skeletal fingers. Every step was a calculated risk, a move in a game where the board was rigged and the pieces were bloodied. You're late, a voice echoed from the darkness. One of Tiho's enforcers stepped into the light, his hand reaching for her bag. Seo-jin didn't pull away. She didn't flinch as his rough fingers brushed against her skin. She looked him in the eye with a gaze so hollow it made him hesitate. A deal of this magnitude requires precision, not speed, she said, her voice a cool, level melody in the salt-heavy air. I have the information. Take me to the exchange point. She felt the weight of the wire against her spine and the faint, rhythmic thrum of the tracker in her pocket. She was walking into the heart of the spider's web, carrying the weight of two different men's agendas. But for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't a passive observer of her own tragedy. She wasn't waiting for the world to finish her. She was inviting it to try. As the van doors slid shut, plunging her into darkness, Seo-jin closed her eyes. She was a live grenade, just as the strategist had predicted, but she was the one holding the pin. She would find Su-yeon, and she would dismantle Tiho's empire with the very silence he had used to bury her family. The hunt had finally begun, and for once the ghost was the hunter. The air inside the abandoned shipyard warehouse tasted of rusted iron and impending rain. Lee Tiho stood on the mezzanine, silhouetted against a flickering halogen light, looking down at Seo-jin like a god who had tired of his creation. Below, the shadows were thick with his men, but the silence was dominated by the hum of the wire against Seo-jin's skin, a heartbeat shared with a detective and a boss who were closing the distance. The codes, Seo-jin, Tiho demanded, his voice echoing in the vast, hollow space. Give me the keys to the kingdom and I will give you your sister. Don't make me remind you how easily a ghost can be erased. Seo-jin stood in the center of the concrete floor, her posture as straight as a blade. She didn't look for Minyi in the rafters. She didn't pray for the sirens of Detective Kim. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, not the one Tiho had asked for, but the one Yunwoo had let her steal from the estate's secure server. You spent 10 years using my sister to build this world, Seo-jin said, her voice rising with a sudden, chilling authority that made the men in the shadows stir. But you forgot that a foundation built on a prisoner is made of sand. This drive doesn't contain Minyi's ledger. It contains the record of your own treason against the board, the money you siphoned, the families you betrayed to rise. I've already sent the first half to your partners. They're deciding your worth as we speak. Tiho's face contorted, the elder statesman mask fracturing. You're bluffing. You're just a waitress who doesn't know when to scream. I stopped screaming a long time ago, Seo-jin replied, stepping into the light. I learned to listen instead. I know where Soo-yeon is, Tiho. I found her before I came here. She isn't your prisoner anymore. She's the one who gave me the encryption keys to your downfall. As the heavy doors of the warehouse burst open and the strobe lights of the police flooded the room, Min-yi was the first through the breach. He didn't fire a weapon. He ran toward the woman who stood perfectly still amidst the chaos. Tiho was dragged down by the weight of his own secrets, his empire collapsing in a chorus of shouted orders and clicking handcuffs. In the sudden, ringing quiet of the aftermath, Min-yi reached for her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Seo-jin. She turned to him, the blue energy of the night finally warming into something human. She didn't look like a ghost or a savior. She looked like a woman who had finally stepped off the bridge. The café is gone, she said, her voice steady but soft. And the ghosts are tired, Min-yi. If we're going to build something, let's make sure it's made of something more than just survival. Let's start with breakfast. She reached out, taking his hand, not for protection, but for the first time for a connection. The rain finally began to fall, washing away the ash of the past.